Welcome to this episode of GRL Law Raw. Those were the words of Chief Justice Cady, the late Chief Justice Cady, in his dissent in the Iowa Supreme Court of State versus Brown, decided on June 28th, 2019, that really allows for what are called pretextual stops under the Iowa Constitution in the state of Iowa.
And that's really what this episode's about, is pretextual stops, and what a more fitting time, given everything that's going on, to talk about pretextual stops, not to mention everything going on with George Floyd, but also coming up on the 1-year anniversary of State versus Brown.
What exactly is a pretextual stop? We hear that phrase, and it's come up a lot more with the current discussions, but what exactly is a pretextual stop?
So a pretextual stop would be a traffic stop that is effectuated by a police officer for a relatively minor traffic violation, with the intent or purpose of doing a greater or further investigation into some other crime, based on some type of suspicion or stereotype that is the officer has based on other observations that they make.
So if we're going to give it a precise definition, we could say it's a traffic stop supported by technical probable cause, but prompted by an ulterior motive of the officer.
Bingo. Yeah.
So what's the big deal?
Well, the big deal currently is, in the wake of George Floyd's death, you're starting to hear again the Black Lives Matter movement, and part of that Black Lives movement is to limit or eliminate pretextual stops. And the reason for that is there's a consensus out there amongst many people that officers are utilizing minor traffic violations in a disproportionate fashion to stop minorities. And it's the exercise of that discretion of the police officers that I think is really troublesome to the people behind that movement.
Well, and let's be direct. I mean, racial disparities in policing and the criminal justice system in general exist and have plagued our communities. There isn't one that's not touched by it, but forever.
That's absolutely true. I mean, there's, history dictates that.
Right. And so when we're talking about pretextual stops, we really have to go back to, if we look at the history of them, and I mean, they've existed probably since vehicles started moving, but as far as the legal rulings that kind of lay the groundwork for where we're at today, in all reality, we got to go all the way back to 1996.
Yeah, when the U.S. Supreme Court decided Wren
versus the United States.
Wren versus United States, yeah. And ultimately, the Supreme Court in Wren laid the groundwork for allowing pretextual stops.
How'd they do that?
They essentially said, any minor traffic violation will support probable cause to stop the vehicle.
So, tail light, license plate light, brake light.
Any minor traffic violation, registration sticker is not placed in the correct spot.
1 mile an hour over the speed limit.
1 mile an hour over, something hanging from your rear view mirror inside your car. And there's just a plethora of traffic violations that can get anybody caught up and provide a basis to stop them.
Well, doesn't that make sense, though? I mean, you're breaking the law. Person's breaking the law, they get pulled over.
It makes sense. The problem with it is if it's being applied in a disproportionate fashion.
Well, let's be honest, the traffic code itself is almost its own volume.
Oh, yeah. In fact, in preparing for this, I found this quote from Arthur Kelsey, who was on the Virginia Court of Appeals, and he wrote, and he sums it up rather well. He said, "So dense is the modern web of motor vehicle regulations that every motorist is likely to get caught in it every time he drives to the grocery store."
That's a solid point. That's some good observations. And in fact, we did a little homework, didn't we?
We sure did.
We're not one just to tell people. We want to kind of show them and give them a feel for exactly what happens and how it can happen. So Monday afternoon, what was it, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon?
Yeah.
We took a 6-mile drive around West Des Moines, and here's what we were able to find.
Windshield obstruction of view. Okay. Expired 10/10, June 1, 2020. License plate frame obscured county. Car on the right, front no front plate. Car on the left, front plate and windshield. Well, there you go. That West Des Moines truck right there that just turned right out of the out of the Phillips 66, turned across traffic. Ooh, there's
Which
another.
doesn't make a lot of sense.
There's another front license plate violation right in front of us in the silver sports car.
But this truck way by doing what he did.
No
and
front
yet
license plate on that vehicle either.
Committed a traffic violation.
No front license plate on this Jeep. Whoop whoop. No front license plate on another vehicle. This guy's driving in our lane.
Where's the license plate light on his dump truck or on his cement truck?
The cement truck was just driving in our lane. Oh, there it is. 4/30/2020. Expired. Inches from it. It says July 20th, but if you couldn't read it, they could stop them. Yep, scooter on the sidewalk. Another front license plate on the left. The county is obscured by the license plate frame. Plate. I guess oh no, you can't see it. It looks like there's a temporary tag in the back left window.
Oh yeah.
But you can't see it. That's a stop. Another Lexus with no front license plate. We're gonna see if there's any traffic violations in the West Des Moines Police Department.
No registration sticker.
No registration sticker right there. No front license plate right there on the Ford van. Oh, here's a no license plate on the Mustang up here. No front license plate on the Mustang.
So is that 2 potential pullovers?
There's 3.
What, 3
3
potential
guaranteed if they
pullovers
wanted to.
in the West Des Moines
Completely
Police Department?
supported by probable cause. Out of
If you were counting from home, that was 20 violations in a 6-mile loop-de-loop that we did, including 3 in West Des Moines Police Department's own parking lot.
That's what's fascinating to me is 3 cars sitting in the West Des Moines Police Department had probable cause for a stop because
This Van Boom.
Yeah, license plates not on the front of the vehicle, registration stickers not there.
Lawbreakers all over the city of West Des Moines. Pull them all over, right?
Well, I mean, theoretically, application of the law, that's what would happen.
Nobody was getting pulled over.
But nobody was getting pulled over, and that's I think where the frustration and concerns for people start to mount is, you know, the guy who's driving his luxury car all suited up on his way to work with no front license plate, you know, maybe isn't going to get pulled over, whereas somebody who's driving not a nice luxury car, dreadlocks, African American, marijuana sticker on the back of the windshield may get pulled over for that same offense, and that's where the frustration is.
And we see it.
Sure,
happen.
sure.
And the police practice of what I would call ticky-tack stops, it doesn't just stop at the stop, does it?
No.
Because they are trained and they're taught to do more. What are they taught to do?
Well, they're trained and taught to try to establish probable cause or reasonable suspicion to further investigate some other crime.
So how does that work? So I'm the driver. You pull me over. You're the officer. Oh yeah, I got a tail light out.
So yeah, the officer's then gonna use his nose, use his eyes, use his ears, try to, see if there's anything that he smells, drugs, alcohol. Is gonna look for, furtive movements, nervousness. All those things have been cited by officers as providing further suspicion that there's some other type of criminal activity going on.
The carotid artery.
Yeah, the carotid artery. It's kind of amazing that the courts have bought a lot of these observations that officers are claiming show that there's something greater going on there that are everyday occurrences. Fast food wrappers in the car, luggage or the lack of luggage.
The air freshener.
The air freshener
in the window.
Yeah, to cover up smells.
Well, and then they'll ask the officers make them go back to the vehicle, sit them there for as long as it takes for them to slowly type in the information while they're talking to them, interrogating them, asking them questions, and it's invasive.
It absolutely is invasive.
It was interesting though, because getting ready for this, we did some research on how some of these police practices came about. And this year I had read, we both read Malcolm Gladwell's Talking to Strangers book. And in there he talked about an experiment that they did in Kansas City back in, it would have been 95, I think. It was published in January of 95, so right around the time that United States Wren versus United States came out.
Just before. Yeah.
Just before. And what they were actually doing there, and this is what started this whole practice, I believe. It got published in the National Institute of Justice. It's called the Kansas City Gun Experiment. You can find it on the web. It's easy to find. They focused that Kansas City's gun crime was off the charts.
Right.
Their violent crimes were out of control, and they wanted to try something new. So they focused on, I believe it was like an 80-block area, and they just started hitting people, stopping them for these ticky-tack traffic violations, looking, watching, seeing if they could see anything more. So they elevated their presence in contacts.
Mm-hmm.
And it showed that it was effective because they were able to identify certain things. These were well-trained, specially trained officers who were taught certain ways, and it was effective. But then the rest of the law enforcement community ran with that.
Right.
To now they're doing it for everything.
Yeah, and that's where you get the frustration is that it's been taken too far.
Well, that study, at the end of that study, this is awesome. The guys that did the study even cautioned against it. They said, intensified gun patrols also need other cautions. They could conceivably have negative effects on police-community relations or be a waste of time and money. They could also pose great risk to officer safety. They could even provoke more crime by making youths subject to traffic stops more defiant of conventional society.
I think the first caution there, the negative effects of police and community relations, is where we're at now. I mean, that's what's happening.
Because people get fed up.
Absolutely.
And I don't care if there's a racial tone to it and a racial disparity to it, that's even more frustrating.
Right.
But like, we had it happen in our little suburban Caucasian neighborhood. I mean, a predominantly white neighborhood. Urbandale decided they were going to do traffic enforcement, 26 over, or 26 miles an hour in 25 zone. They were pulling people over. Somebody had complained about speed and all that.
Right.
And didn't take long for the neighborhood to get up in arms about the increased police presence bothering people for breaking the law.
Right.
Right.
And the flip side to this movement, I guess, and the flip side to pretextual stops is that, well, so what? They're doing their job. The police are investigating crime, and that's all fine and well. But it circles back to the discretion that is given to the officers, and then it's the application of that discretion where you can run into problems.
Well, and there's no checks and balances. And let's be honest, the courts are really complicit in the problem that we have here today.
Sure, another thing in getting ready for this, I think people don't necessarily believe that there might be an issue. That this really isn't as bad or as happening as often as people are complaining about. So I found it's a Stanford Law Review article, and I don't even think it's been formally published yet. It's
Hot off the
It
press.
says forthcoming in 2021, but it's
We didn't steal it. We found it
Yeah.
legit.
legitimately online. It's titled An Empirical Assessment of Pretextual Stops and Racial Profiling, authored by Stephen Rushin, Rushin, and Griffin Edwards. And what this law review article did is it took a bunch of empirical data from the state of Washington.
Why Washington?
Washington had a decision that outlawed pretextual stops, a court decision that said you cannot do pretextual stops under their state constitution.
The court stepped in and said,
The court stepped in and said, not going to do it.
Good.
And then, I think it was 10, 12 years later, they reversed course and said now pretextual stops are okay. So you had this data set of pre-outlawed pretextual stops and post-pretextual stops. And so they
Rare
compared-
opportunity.
Rare opportunity. So they compared that data, and what they saw was a significant increase in pretextual stops and racial disparities on those pretextual stops.
So, because there are people that will flat out say, well, minorities tend to live in higher crime areas, or that the higher crime areas have a higher minority population. That's why there's increased contact between law enforcement and minorities as opposed to the others. That would completely debunk.
It does. And the other thing about that is getting back to your complacency with the courts is there is no checks and balances here. There is no way for us to go and look at raw data to really see what's happening, because traffic stops that don't result in any other type of criminal activity aren't ever brought to light.
So the only time that a court can even do anything about it is when a criminal charge gets filed as a result of this, although albeit legal conduct currently.
Right.
Or if somebody were to file a lawsuit civilly, which if it's just a traffic stop, who's going to go through the time, effort, money to do that?
Exactly. So what's happened is a system is set up where they basically say no harm, no foul, right? So police stop. Don't find anything. All of a sudden they find something, and now a lawyer comes in and looks at this and says, well, I can't say that this was a racial profiling case because I have no idea how many other stops this particular officer did on minorities or other people, and so there's no way to gauge that.
But even if you can prove the officer was racially biased, currently in Iowa,
Yes,
right? After State versus Brown, it was raised. The public defender's office took this one up and said, listen, we believe this stop was pretextual based upon race or based upon whatever it was on that stop,
Right.
or to investigate something else.
Yep.
Outlaw this.
Exactly.
Say you can't do this. You can't stop based upon an improper subjective intent.
What they said is, Supreme Court, take our Iowa Constitution and provide greater protections to Iowans.
Because the federal Constitution, you can do whatever you want.
The federal Constitution, they already said that pretextual stops were valid and legal. So Brown gave the court an opportunity to step in and say, yes, under our Constitution, much like the state of Washington did, we're going to provide protections to our citizens under our Constitution that protects them from pretextual stops. And in a 4-3 decision,
4-3, yeah.
they said not going to happen.
So 4 voted to allow pretextual stops in essence. 3 voted against it. Chief Justice Cady at the time, who we heard from at the very beginning, was one who said, no, we got to consider the race. We got to consider the subjective intent.
Right. We need to step in here and provide protections to the citizens under our Constitution.
But the right people were outvoted.
Right. 4-3, and pretextual stops are still legal and valid in Iowa under our Constitution.
In our probable cause search, our little drive around town, we also noticed some things where if you got close enough, you could see a license plate or a temporary plate, or maybe like you could could make a mistake.
Right.
So what probably adds to the frustration, not only can officers stop for any ticky-tack reason, they can be wrong about it too, and the courts have said, as long as it's reasonable, as long as we say it's reasonable, that's just fine.
Right, and I think that, I mean, I don't know if people really truly grasp and understand that what you're talking about here is mistake of law, mistake of fact scenarios, and
where the officer doesn't know the law or has the law wrong,
right,
or is mistaken as to the true facts.
right. So I think there's a case on this in Iowa. The officer pulled somebody over, didn't see or claimed he didn't see the temporary tag in the rear window. As he was approaching the vehicle, saw the temporary tag, and they said, well, he can still proceed with the traffic stop at that point. And because it was a mistake of fact when he stopped him, and because the officer made a reasonable mistake of fact, it was still a valid traffic stop.
What about mistakes of law?
That's the real frustrating part, in my opinion, is some states have allowed officers the stop to be legitimately and justified even if the officer mistakenly applies the law.
What's Iowa say about that though?
Iowa Iowa currently has said that mistake of law will not justify the stop. In other words, if the officer makes a mistake of law, it's a bad stop.
If he doesn't know the law, stops and says this is a violation, but it's really not a violation,
right,
that can invalidate the stop.
correct. Now, you know, it's interesting dichotomy because law enforcement officers are charged with upholding and enforcing the laws.
Yes, they should know it.
They should know it. Ordinary citizens are supposed to know what the law
You're presumed
is.
to know the law, even
Right.
if you haven't read the books.
But you and I and any ordinary citizen doesn't get a mistake of law, get out of jail
Yeah.
free card.
True.
You
True.
know,
For anything.
For anything.
Interesting. So, in addition to, so really, the court has all but said, have at it.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
They have.
We don't care.
They have created the system, which has created the problem. They have given officers the discretion and ability to let explicit or implicit biases dictate who they're going to stop and for what.
So let me ask you this. If an officer were to even just be completely truthful, I stopped that vehicle because that person was black, but I had probable cause because the license plate frame was obscuring the county.
Yeah,
What
but
happens?
Nothing. It's a legitimate stop because he had probable cause to stop the vehicle,
Regardless of his motivation.
even if it's racially motivated.
And could the driver sue the officer
The driver.
successfully?
Well, that's an interesting question. The answer is there's two problems with that. Number one is you have qualified immunity for the officers.
Oh, that's a whole.
Yeah, and that's something we don't want to get into here.
But we're gonna get into it in later episodes
Right.
because that's important. That and a few other
The
things.
qualified immunity essentially gives the officer protections under the law that they can't be sued. In a nutshell. The other problem is you know what is that person's damages? And
Because
there's-
the stop was valid.
right,
Yeah.
the stop was valid.
You get nowhere.
You get nowhere.
So this needs to be fixed.
It does. There's some problems here, and now's a right time to address it. The way to address it, or one of the ways to address it, is looking at legislative changes.
So you legislate and a law gets passed, and I know the city councils are talking about this right now. I know the state discussions, there's federal discussions. So you make a law that says you can't stop based upon protected class of the individual, the motivation. You can't do a pretextual stop. Prove it.
Exactly, and that's the problem. Is you're in a position where you can't prove it right now, and the only real way that we've discussed to proceed remedying that issue is to catalog and create a database of all police encounters that are a result of traffic.
And
stops.
before we
All.
get to that, because I'm confident that's a way to solve all of this. what about creating classes of offenses? In other words, law enforcement, there's primary, some states have primary and secondary offenses like we had with the
Cell phones.
cell phones,
Yeah.
the cell phone use. What if we did something like that?
You certainly could do that. Then you got to kind of dance the line of, all right, is this a safety related issue? Is it not a safety related issue?
And it still doesn't necessarily resolve the improper motivation for the stops, the improper motivation for the interference.
No, it doesn't.
They just have to find the proper violation to pull somebody over.
Right, and on the flip side of that is the way the system is now. The legislature can just continue to pass traffic violation after traffic violation, new traffic violations,
Create new ones.
to create new opportunities and ways for people to get pulled over.
So, the icing on the cake, though, the solution, the actual workable solution that we've come up with, I think is important. I think it's easy to implement. It's the easiest thing to do, and I think it had the biggest impact forever. Is what?
Is to have all traffic stops, whether they result in a criminal charge or not, a warning or not, all traffic stops cataloged and recorded in a database with the date of the traffic stop, the officer who conducted the traffic stop, the demographics of where the traffic stop occurred, and then ultimately the information about the driver.
Right. Because if we, and a lot of this is already in a computer system. Because when you run a traffic stop, if the officer runs a traffic stop, they slide the driver's license through the reader.
Right.
And everything on that license then populates into the field for the citation.
Correct.
So we have name, we have ethnicity, we have date of birth, we have height, we have
An address.
we have all of that information. There's a location of where the alleged violation takes place. That's in there. The officer signs off on the citation. So all that information is readily accessible. All we need to do is, one, make it a point that everybody knows this is being monitored, and two, it just needs to be put together in a way that a report can be generated.
Right. Yeah, because what it ultimately does is it provides a significant layer of transparency. All traffic stops, regardless of whether the person is issued a warning, a ticket, there's some other crime that they're arrested for, or they're just allowed to go on their merry way. Every single traffic stop is recorded, and that gives you a database of.
And we don't even necessarily need. I mean, we love video. We want more of that, but it doesn't. It's just data.
It's just data.
Just data collection.
Absolutely.
And we're partnered with Oh Crap App, and they've created a post-stop questionnaire.
Right.
That somebody can fill out if they get pulled over, because they recognize the importance of having that data. Why wouldn't we impose that? Because if an officer knows my statistics are being kept,
Right.
I am being monitored, I am being watched by outside sources, that would have to have a remedial effect on them and their, whether implicit or explicit biases that impact who they stop and why they stop them.
Exactly. It's the same argument and same philosophy and reasoning for body cameras.
Yep.
It's that transparency element to it.
I think that's a great idea.
I do too.
We should pass that on.
We should.
Well, we're about out of time. We are out of time. We appreciate you guys tuning in. That's it for this episode. We'll certainly be looking forward to chatting with everybody here in the near future.
Yep.
Any ideas, suggestions? We'll welcome the feedback. We love new ideas of things that you'd like us to talk about. So by any means, or by all means, drop us a note, give us a suggestion. We're happy to consider it. See ya.